VC++ 2020 is delighted to welcome Michel Buffet. Michel, can you tell the audience a little bit about your background?
Sure, and thank you for your invitation, David. So I'm a senior client partner at Korn Ferry, based in Princeton, New Jersey. And my role is really to help my clients define solutions for their organizational and talent development needs. Just maybe a few things about Korn Ferry. I think a lot of people obviously know us for our talent acquisition services, our search business, but obviously we do a lot more in the space of consulting services. Just a few numbers maybe about us, I think, that tell the story. So we've got benchmark data on 12,000 organizations. We've conducted 74 million assessments. We've got 30,000 success profiles. We've partnered with 97% of the Fortune 100, and we're in 53 countries with about 8,000 colleagues. So I think that why this is relevant, I think, to the conversation today around diversity and inclusion is clearly we are ourselves a very diverse organization spanning time zones and regions. So I hope I can bring some of that to this discussion today.
So I'm very interested in understanding from the perspective of talent development how inclusion is represented and taught, and what kinds of programs have been most effective in raising understanding of the benefits.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Sure, of course. So I think we need to recognize the time that we're in, because obviously I think D&I work has been part of our DNA, for a long time. We've been doing work in the space and in the industry in general. I mean, this is, we have now sort of a number of years behind us of doing this work around diversity and inclusion. But I think we have to put it in the context of this particular year in 2020, where after the murder of George Floyd, things were different. And it has the need to really think about diversity and inclusion has become that much more acute. And we've seen this in the way CEOs and leaders have responded to the crisis and have expressed very unanimously their commitment to drive more inclusive and diverse organizations. So I think that's the context that we're in, and I think as a result, it's a shifting landscape. So there's a lot of programs that have been out there, in development for driving greater diversity. I think we see more of a push for inclusion, right? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of programs had that diversity piece well taken care of, but we realized there was really only half of the coin, and the inclusion piece is that much more important because it's, there's a metaphor that's used a lot to describe the difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is being invited to the ball, and inclusion is being invited to dance, right?
Absolutely.
So that's I think very representative of our thinking at Korn Ferry and how we think about our D&I work. It's not just about having those standalone programs. It's actually embedding a D&I perspective in everything we do, internally and in terms of our solutions.
So what are the things that you see at a C-suite level that have been most impactful in really propagating this mindset down into an organization?
Yeah.
What can leadership do to send the message?
I think it starts with self-awareness. I mean, I think any kind of change, behavioral change at the individual level, as well as organizational structural change, starts with taking the pulse of where you are and where you need to be, right? So this comparison of your present reality and your aspired reality and your purpose is where we see the work start, right? And so accordingly, in terms of development, it starts with kind of an assessment, right? Of where are you in that journey of promoting diversity and inclusion and being an agent of a champion for that. So it really starts with an understanding of where you are, where are your strengths, where are your areas for development. We've designed actually kind of a model to help leaders think about, what great looks like. It comes down to a number of practices, right? You sort of have to show a certain number of practices that we see based on our research on all the data points that I mentioned earlier that we have about leaders that are associated with greater diversity and inclusion. So there's sort of 5 disciplines. If you're interested, I can get into that.
Totally interested. Yeah.
Yeah.
So metrics is part of this, and I think there are metrics about various pipelines for recruiting, promotion, talent development, special projects, that's it. And there's also audits of identifying systemic bias in existing processes. So
Yeah.
can you talk about both of those a bit?
Yeah, and actually the words are really important, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the shifts that we've tried to drive is away from unconscious bias. I think you see a lot of programs that talk about unconscious bias, and we think it is an important element of the puzzle. But it's how do you move faster from that to actually conscious inclusion, and that's why we actually coined our program, differently than maybe other firms. We've sort of taken a step further to say we want to drive for conscious inclusion, and move beyond just recognizing unconscious bias.
Right. No, I think one of the themes of the conference from many speakers is that being intentional about this is fundamental to affecting change. So I totally validate that from other speakers as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in that context, what's the reasonable cadence or metrics, or how do you manage that conversation? How do you self-report? One of the things, just to maybe elaborate on that a little bit, one of the themes I've heard from other speakers is that there are a lot of business practices startups use about being really honest of looking at their metrics and their product and the feedback loop around that.
Yeah.
But companies rarely apply the same discipline and aggressiveness to that feedback loop, to their culture and their inclusion practices. So maybe you could comment on that.
Well, I think it's recognizing that it's a system, right? You have to look at the different elements of the system. Why is there racism? Why is there some discrimination? Understanding the underpinning of that. What are the different elements? And I think just to make it simple here, and I think that it's helped actually convey the message, trying to find the simplicity in the way that we describe something that is actually quite complex, is a distinction between the structural and the behavioral aspects of bias. And so, what we do with our clients is that we look at those 2 axes, if you will, to say, what are the structural elements in your organization that you need to change to promote greater diversity and inclusion, and then what are the behaviors, the practices that you need to engage in. So at a really simple level, you can use that structure, and that is what we use to kind of diagnose where an organization is at in terms of its D&I journey. So from a structure perspective, it's in the way role descriptions are written. It's in the way your talent acquisition processes are laid out. And it really, the devil's in the details, is in the words that are used that we know, either support or don't support diversity and inclusion. And then in terms of the behaviors, back to what I was saying earlier about the disciplines, right? Authenticity, it starts with, being true to yourself, having the humility, putting aside your ego, your lack of awareness, your misunderstanding, having kind of emotional resilience. So being able to take, tough feedback, to look at yourself, with an honest lens, being curious, asking questions. I think that's really probably one of the most important dimensions is
Mhm.
you have to ask the questions. I think part of what we're seeing leaders struggle with driving a D&I agenda is, is sometimes a lack of inquisitiveness, is not asking the questions, not having the curiosity.
And I think the conversations are often emotionally uncomfortable, and so there's fear and avoidance around opening that can of worms and
Yeah.
figuring out how to push through that.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit? So Korn Ferry is a global organization, and you're in the U.S. now, but you've lived in Europe and are a citizen of the world. Can you talk a little bit about how diversity and inclusion plays through cross-culturally in different regions of the world?
Oh, that's a great question. It's actually I was introduced to that 15 years ago, probably on an engagement with a client. They were, so this was a global consumer packaged goods organization that had this program as part of their onboarding protocol to introduce the notion of diversity and inclusion. But this was a U.S. company, so it was a very U.S.-centric definition of D&I. And as you can imagine, it wasn't going very well in other regions because the dimensions of diversity and inclusion, although the principles are universal, you have to also, you're dealing with different situations in different societies in different countries around the world. So you have to adjust, you have to adapt, you have to understand, how do you translate, how do you convey the same message across cultures. So I think it is very much a dimension you pay attention to. So in the example of our own firm, Korn Ferry, we are diverse organizations. We are managing that diversity at a global level. Structurally, we ensure that there's diversity in the representation of members in key governance bodies, in leading our practices. And so that is a message that we want to convey to our client as well, is to say, you want to look at how you're driving diversity and inclusion globally, but also locally, and understand having an organization that allows you to have that dialogue between global and local implementation of your D&I strategy. It's very important to have an awareness of the differences while being very clear about what is universal, what are the principles, again, that cut across geographies. And that really kind of, in a lot of ways, defines who you are as an organization.
So one of the things, Michel, in addition to the background you've covered already, is you're an extraordinary executive coach. Can you talk about coaching diversity and inclusion and how that practice has evolved and what kinds of things are most important to seek in coaching if you're trying to improve in this area?
Well, first of all, thank you for the compliment. Yes, I think, and then I feel like I bring sort of my own experience, being, as you mentioned before, sort of a transnational person,
Mm-hmm.
right? I grew up in France. Done most of my career in the US, but always working with global clients. In the context of coaching, which is an important practice for me, it really, it's the same idea that I mentioned earlier around self-awareness, right? And core to any coaching engagement, it starts with a sense of where are you and what do you aspire to? It's sort of that parallel exercise of projecting yourself in the future, understanding who do I want to be. So in this case, around D&I, as a coachee, how do you define what great looks like for you? Where do you want to be? How do you want to lead? And then where are you today? And where are the areas for development? So I shared before sort of those 5 disciplines, we call them the 5 disciplines of the inclusive leader. These obviously would have to be important elements that we explore in the coaching relationship,
Mm-hmm.
to understand where are you today on each one of those elements, and then setting very clear goals about where you want to go, what are the key shifts that you want to do. So I could use maybe an example,
Sure.
if it's helpful, but when it comes to, for example, flexibility. So flexibility is one of the elements, one of the 5 disciplines. You can look at sort of what are the signs of your own flexibility today. How agile are you? What's the level of plasticity that you have around your beliefs, your values, your practices? Do you have different ways of engaging with different people in different contexts? What's your ability to adjust the way you convey your message to the different audience? And that's a really critical element of diversity and inclusion.
So let's talk about another scenario that many leaders face, which is you have someone in your organization that's really weak in this area, right? And they need help. Maybe there's been some regrettable incident that's sending shockwaves, right? But it happens.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for founders, CEOs that are dealing with this, where they're trying to help the person get through to being better in this area, and maybe having to overcome all kinds of organizational baggage in that process?
Yeah. So I would maybe distinguish between what we do at the individual level,
Yeah.
also what we do at the systems level, because
Okay.
you're likely to have much greater outcomes if you're looking at both at the same time, right?
Okay.
So oftentimes when that request comes in, so as you can imagine, after the murder of George Floyd, there's been an increase, a surge, I would say, actually, in need for help and guidance in this space.
Mm-hmm.
And our response has always been sort of what we've applied to ourselves, which is we've taken on actually a systemic approach where we ran a number of internal webinars led by our CEO with diverse employees, Black employees, invited to be part of those discussions. And these conversations that were internal were actually opened up to people outside of Korn Ferry. That's something we had never done before. We've actually invited anybody who wanted to join the call to be a witness of that conversation that was happening internally. And that led to the idea and the development of an offering for organizations,
right,
to help them craft those exact kind of calls. To answer your question, like how do you respond to an incident? I think it's recognizing how much of it is the individual and how much of it is the culture in the system. Sure. And you have to look at both.
So just to play that back,
yeah,
transparency is important.
Yeah.
Having a framework that grounds any individual response as flowing from company process and values moves the dialogue in a more constructive direction than just having say a Me Too moment, right? Where you're trying to figure out how to do damage control. Okay.
I mean, it's trying to move away from something that would appear to be too remedial, right?
Yeah.
It's more addressing, well, when someone in an organization, when a leader in an organization behaves in a way that's counter to the culture, it says more than just about this leader. It says something about the organization itself. And that's why I think our strong belief, and it's rooted in my education, is that you can't separate the individual from the system. And so you have to look at what is the context and how do you move the needle in the context so that you can have the greatest impact on individual trajectories. And then, that doesn't, now that's only half of the equation. You have to obviously do one-on-one work with leaders and understand their own story and their own journey towards greater D&I, leadership. So I think, to answer back your question earlier on coaching, we use the typical tools of coaching to address the question of, being an inclusive leader.
And I want to come back full circle to culture, because you talked about culture, and one of the things I've seen is if you have a inclusion conversation, it essentially goes to culture, and that if the inclusion doesn't flow from culture, it's much harder to achieve lasting results. So can you talk a little bit about uh, the importance of culture and culture signaling and culture definition, and what founders, what leaders, what C-suites can do to make sure that they are creating a culture of inclusion?
Yeah, no. Well, I think first, and acknowledging that is
Yeah,
already a huge step, because having done a lot of work, over the last 25 years, with a range of organizations, I think there's been an evolution, and it's only a greater appetite and awareness of the importance of culture, but we still have a long way to go in many organizations. And so I think having clarity around that, around the importance of culture and how it plays out, what are the values, the fundamental values that animate you as a person and as a leader. Just to go back to the question around coaching, our coaching work, almost always starts with this point, right? What are you made of? What are you about? What do you care about? What is the change that you wanna create? What's the impact you want to have in this world? And so if we look at diversity and inclusion, it's really understanding what are the values that you want to promote, that you want to champion, and that's what I would connect to culture. Culture is also, there's a connection to the business aspect, right? Because let's not forget that all these organizations we're talking about are business organizations. They have a kind of a strategy and a mission to their consumers and to their clients, and so we know that there's a big part of D&I that's really also about recognizing the fact that when you do this, it is also good for the business. We know that organizations that have a better scorecard on their D&I do better across a variety of other indicators: innovation, growth, customer centricity. I mean, just about every aspect of performance is positively impacted by the diversity and inclusion of the organization.
fantastic. Let me just say, any last words for leaders looking to advance inclusion in their organization?
I mean, what I would say is that it's an amazing journey. It's a journey of self-discovery. If you're if you are curious about the world around you and about how different people are around you, only growth can happen from this. There's really no loss. Like there's no, and that's always sort of the piece in me that I grew up in a cross-cultural family. My mom's Spanish, my dad is French. So I grew up immersed into that cultural difference. I grew up in an LGBT youth, so there was also that element of diversity. Then I, met my husband, who's American, moved to the US. I mean, every aspect of sort of my journey has been constantly realizing that there was a different way of doing things, that we don't come to the table with the same perception. So naturally, I think it's sort of like I had to land in a place where that was going to become, central to the work I do, because it is so central to my identity. But I think you don't have to have that trajectory, that background to have the interest and to be a champion in D&I. I think that we can find that diversity. You just have to look a little closer and realize that, you can find your own experience of diversity and bring that forward.
I love it. Michel, thank you so much.
All right. My pleasure. Thank you, David.